Welcome back. I hope you're thinking of lots of questions that you'll call in at the end or comments. There's so much in this information that has so many important implications. Before we get started again, I'd like to request that those of you that are watching this on the web, if you would email us as to where you are located, that would be very helpful, and it would be quite interesting as well. So if you're watching this on the web, if someone would email your location. We talked before the break about basic needs of the brainstem's need for safety, and the feeling brain's need for love. So before we move on up to the conscious mind, let's make this hand model again. Your two fists together. And notice again where your brainstem is, where your safety needs are processed. And then inside your hand model, if you wiggle your pointer finger and your middle finger, just kind of wiggle it inside, feel it tucked in there, that would be where your feeling brain is on your hand model. Another model for the feeling brain and the brainstem and how that fits together is you can make a brainstem by taking one arm, making a fist, there's your stem, and then your other hand, if you spread your fingers out and wrap it around, these are the structures, the limbic system structures that wrap around the brainstem. So we have the stem coming up into the limbic system. We're getting more sophisticated as we move up. And now we're going to move up to the conscious mind. So if you go back to this hand model with our brainstem and our feeling brain, and then take a look at the top of your hands, and notice that where your fingers meet together, it kind of looks like wrinkles or convolutions. And that actually is our thinking brain. But a much better way to do a hand model would be to have on a pair of gloves, which I just happen to have right here, that are about 1/8 of an inch or to 1/4 of an inch thick. And so what I have now is a really good representation of the conscious level of the brain, the cortex. Cortex means bark, not bark like a dog, but bark of a tree. It means outer covering, because this is a very thin layer between 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch thick layer that wraps around the entire brain. We talked last time about the fact that we have 100 billion neurons, and we have 500 trillion connections between those neurons. We have a full 1/3 of all of our neurons, all of our brain cells, are in this 1/8 of an inch thick layer. So if you could peel this layer off of the rest of the brain and smooth it out, you'd actually have quite a large area. You'd have an area that is 2 feet by 2 feet square. It needs to be this large. Even though it's thin, it's quite large, so that you can pack all of those neurons into this area. This is why sometimes you may have heard the term gray matter. Gray matter are the neurons that are in the thinking part of the brain that are packed together so densely that it's the blood that makes this area of the brain appear gray. So if our heads were smooth, think about how enormously large our heads would be, which would make the birth process even more difficult than it already is, and it would also be very difficult proportionally. So the brain, the top layer, is mushed together. It's all wrinkled together so that it fits, and that's why you have that convoluted look of the cortex. Now this literally is our thinking cap, and if you can zoom in on this, you'll see that this is the convoluted cortex, and then under the bill it says thinking cap here. And I don't know about you, but when I was little, my teachers, I remember especially being in 2nd grade, and my teacher used to say all the time, "Okay, boys and girls, this is going to be really hard, so everybody put on your thinking caps now." And what's really interesting is that saying is truly what we want to be able to do when we're learning. We want to be able to be focused in this thinking brain, the thinking cap. But we're not going to be focused in this area very well, very efficiently, if our basic needs of safety and love are not met. So I'm going to put thinking cap up here on this big brain. And now we're going to talk about a particular area of the thinking cortex. Remember, this was the sensory area here. So last time when we were exploring, we were talking about vision and hearing and moving and imagining, all in the higher level thinking part of the brain. This is all conscious mind. There's an area in the thinking cap called the prefrontal lobes. We've already seen it a few times. That's our imagination. And this is really control central. This is the area of the brain that basically runs the show if things are working well. The whole brain needs to work together in harmony. So let's take a look at the prefrontal cortex and its description. And that takes you back to your diagram that has the brain layers on it, and I believe that was on page 16. And I'll just have it on the screen for a moment so that you can reorient yourself. Survival brain, safety, feeling brain, love, thinking brain, especially the chief executive officer. Because this is the learning brain, its basic need is guidance. Guidance. And here are some of the functions of the survival brain. Again, it's at the conscious mind. It's the seat of our imagination. All of our higher level thinking is put together in this area of the brain. That means that what we're learning as we're moving, as we're seeing things, as we're hearing things, it's all integrated together so that it makes sense, so that it becomes a pattern in the chief executive officer of the brain. Our emotional regulation and our emotional intelligence skills, the ability to, as we'll see in a moment, think about what we're feeling and to make choices based on our thoughts. Emotional intelligence skills are things like empathy, social skills, self-motivation, all those higher level emotional skills that we need to be able to do well in the world. Attention and concentration. If we're going to be going into more depth about learning and the brain, we'd focus a lot on this area, attention and concentration, because it's the prefrontal lobes that really run the show there. For children that have attention deficit disorder, one of the thoughts is that it's the prefrontal area that is the area that's not being activated enough. It's not staying alert enough. So all of these skills that you see are often skills that children that have the label of attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have. And we also have short-term memory here as a prefrontal lobe function. So because this is the learning brain, this is the area that needs modeling, looking at good examples of being in the world, and also coaching and guidance. So let's take a look at our first section of this. We're going to be dividing this up quite a bit. And I'm going to bring an overhead down for you here. And if you take a look at page 45, you'll see that the thinking brain is responsible for self-awareness, empathy, and social skills. What we want to do to help children, to guide children in developing these, is self-awareness first, because that's really the foundation of all the other emotional skills. We want to help children identify and accept their feelings. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a moment, but let's look at the big picture first. And then help them express those feelings in ways that are appropriate. And that ties in to coaching the child in social skills that are appropriate, cooperative, helpful, and to model those social skills, because children learn by watching us, and to be patient as we remember that each time we coach and model for the child these appropriate ways of acting and being, it allows for more pathways to be set down in the brain. It's that idea again that repetition builds pathways. So let's take a look at our big brain model for a moment and think about this. When you help a child identify their feelings, so if they're feeling really mad, really frustrated, and they throw something at their brother, for example, if you help them put a word to that, I feel frustrated, I feel mad, right there you're developing the foundation for self-awareness. So when they can connect that feeling, which is coming from the emotional brain, with the words, which takes them to the thinking brain, you're giving them right there a very important foundation for healthy emotional skills, because that ability to put our words to our feelings, that self-awareness, recognizing what we're feeling and then putting a word to it, begins to make a connection between the thinking brain and the feeling brain. So these are wires that symbolize pathways that start to be into place. So every time we put words to an emotion, we begin to reinforce these pathways that are connecting between the thinking brain and the feeling brain. That way, then, you can give the child the power of choice. Because if they are not putting their words to their feelings, they're just going to simply react. And that takes us back down into the survival brain, that reactive, unconscious survival brain. But if they can think, I'm feeling angry, and recognize that, and many children that have anger management problems, right there is a big place, a big missing piece for them, because they don't recognize they're angry while they're feeling anger. They may recognize it later. So self-awareness is the ability to recognize and identify those feelings as we're having them. I'm feeling really angry. That shifts us up to our thinking brain. And then we have the choice of what we're going to do about that anger. Are we going to strike out, or are we going to have some way to manage that anger and come about the problem more cooperatively? So every time you coach a child to manage their frustration, manage their anger, to share when they don't feel like it, all of those things that we do on just a daily basis, you're helping those pathways be put into place. If they are coming to you after years and years and years of no coaching or modeling in this area, or coaching and modeling in a negative sense, the idea that fighting it out is the best solution to a problem, then you're going to have a lot of negative pathways in place that you need to overcome. You can't obliterate those pathways totally, but they do eventually get pruned away through lack of use. Remember that from last time, that what isn't used is eventually lost and eventually pruned. And in the meantime, what you can do is give children the opportunity through your coaching and through your modeling to have new pathways, new choices to make. I have a foster parent who shared with me that she had been working with a 13-year-old girl who had recently come to her home. And one of the things that really helped this girl was this idea. She shared with her the idea that behavior creates pathways, and we create new pathways. And so when this girl would be reacting to something in an inappropriate way, the foster mom would remind her, well, that's an old pathway. Remember what we talked about some other things that you could do that would be new pathways that you could put into place? For example, counting to 10, or taking time to calm down, walk away from the situation, etc. And the girl, because it helped her think about her behavior not so much as who she was, but just pathways that were laid down, really could connect and relate to that concept. If you turn to the next page, on page 46, you'll see another area that this chief executive officer is responsible for, and we are just leading right into it actually in our example, and that is self-control. So when we control our behavior, we are activating these pathways between the thinking brain and the feeling brain and the survival brain. So children need guidance in this area. They need to have clear, appropriate limits that are consistent. They need to be coached to develop this self-control through fair consequences that they can learn from. If we spank or hit as punishment, think about what area of the brain takes over when we do that. It shifts them down into the survival brain, and then we have a war on our hands. So you want it to be something that the child can learn from in a positive way. You need to help the child manage stress and model healthy stress management practices. We're going to come back to this concept in just a moment. But let's go back to the idea of self-control. And I'm going to go back to our big brain model here. So in terms of how the brain is myelinating, how it's insulating its pathways, there's a network of pathways that connects the thinking brain and the feeling brain that has to do with self-control. And it starts to myelinate at about 2 years old. It starts to become active. And now think about that with these terrific 2-year-olds that we have who are constantly challenging authority, constantly loving the sound of no, 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 no. It seems like they're contrary to everything that adults want them to do. It's a very healthy way for them to be, and it's something that I think is helpful as you lose your patience sometimes with this process. Because what they're doing as you then step in and lay down the law, for example, there's a wonderful quote from one of Foster Klein's books that says, "Children at this age are learning basic German Shepherd. Come, sit, stay, no, do, don't," just real simple commands. As they're learning to accept authority and accept those commands, it's allowing the pathways that are responsible for self-control, responsible for hooking up the thinking brain with the subconscious mind to start to be created. So children are actually internalizing those commands that we're giving them. Each time you give the child a limit, and each time it's followed through consistently, each time there is a positive learning experience, those pathways become thicker. But this process is a long process. And if you remember the myelination schedule that we looked at the beginning of the evening, this area of the brain doesn't fully myelinate until late adolescence. So 22, 23, 24, these pathways are still forming, they're still myelinating. So this area is not completely ready to solo, even though kids that are at that age think that it is. They still need a lot of our guidance as adults, and that's children that have been raised in a very healthy setting. So again, each time you help children with those limits that you set down, and you help them learn through positive, logical consequences, you're helping set down pathways. This takes us to the concept of stress in the brain, and I like this section because it really helps tie everything in together that we've been talking about so far in terms of brain layers. So if you take a look at a diagram that you have on page 48, I'm going to be showing this to you in parts, and we're also going to be using our big brain as a way to model this. So you see on the top of page 48 the term stress in the brain. And the first term is a term that you may not recognize. I know I didn't know this term before when I first saw it. It's called eustress. And it's a term that attempts to define stress that's positive, because often we think about stress as negative. But there's positive stress as well. So positive stress is any time you are engaged in something that brings you a lot of pleasure, but that also is challenging in just the right way. Not so much that it is causing you to feel threatened, but enough to keep it interesting. So when you're doing something that's pleasurable that doesn't have that little bit of challenge, like just vegging out sometimes and reading just a really fun book, or watching a sort of a mindless TV show, that gives us downtime, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't really stimulate the brain. When you are involved in something that causes this reaction, eustress, which is pleasure and challenge, you might be doing a sport, creating an art, playing music, reading and thinking about something that's stretching your mind. That type of stress is extremely positive, and it opens, metaphorically, a gate to the thinking brain. It allows the thinking brain to just be flooded in terms of how well it's processing information. If you look at a PET scan, a scan of how the brain is being activated, when somebody is doing something pleasurable or has just completed that, you'll see the thinking brain lit up, literally, with light, because it's so fluid and it's so activated. It also causes the feeling brain to release chemicals. Some of them are hormones, some of them are neurotransmitters, but these chemicals not only make us feel good emotionally, but they also help the brain, the thinking brain, to process information faster, better. So when you feel good, you really think better. Some of those chemicals you see there are the endorphins, serotonin, and dopamine. And serotonin, for example, is one of the chemicals that the layperson really has heard a lot about recently because it's been linked to depression. Not enough serotonin means that we don't have these feel-good chemicals in our system and we can actually feel depressed. So looking at the big brain model here, whenever we do something that brings us joy, that makes us feel happy, that brings us pleasure, that also creates that little bit of tension, creates that challenge, it causes the feeling brain to open kind of a gate. I like to think about this as a feelings gate, and it shifts our focus up to our thinking cap and really helps this brain process well. So when you personally, or when you're working with children, are doing something that you have passion for, that you really love to do, it's a very good brain exercise to do, and it also really helps your immune system because these positive chemicals are healing. They create a stronger immune system. So when you're happy and joyful and you're experiencing things that bring meaning to your life and that bring you challenge, you often don't get as many colds and you don't get sick as often. How many children do you have coming into your home that haven't had much of this experience? And when they are doing something that's pleasurable, it isn't really eustress. It's vegging out in front of TV or doing something that takes the least amount of effort, because there's such a weight of the survival brain and the feeling brain not getting its needs met. So one of the things you can do for children is to have fun and to help them find something. It doesn't matter what it is as long as it's not hurtful to other people. Find something they care about. Find something that they're interested in. So that's eustress. And let's see, I'm looking for one of my props here. Every time you experience joy, and I'll let the camera zoom into this, you literally bathe the brain and the body in joy juices, if we can use that term. And so think about it as a spray bottle. That's just bathing our whole body-mind system in those wonderful healing chemicals. Good reason to enjoy yourself and take care of yourself, especially for you that are doing such an important role in taking care of children. You need to be able to replenish yourself as well. So then we have the negative kinds of stress, and that takes you back to your diagram, and this is distress. And distress is anything that causes us to feel threatened in any way, any kind of a threat. It might be a physical threat, so a fear that there's going to be harm. It could be a threat of self-esteem, that when I am in school, everybody thinks I'm dumb because I can't learn. It can be a threat in terms of anger, that you feel that someone is attacking you. Whatever that might be, that causes your system to feel distress. So we have two reactions when we feel this. Here's our first reaction. This is the quickest reaction. Our feeling brain, on a subconscious level, our thinking brain isn't involved in this yet, shuts the brain down, shuts the road down to the higher level thinking brain. It closes the gate to the thinking brain, and it downshifts our control into the survival brain. At the same time, it releases fight, freeze, flight, fight chemicals, stress chemicals. And we saw at the beginning of the session that it's that response that is really regulated in the stem of the brain, in our survival brain. So the chemicals that are released are stress-related chemicals, and one that's really been talked about a lot is cortisol. Cortisol is a major stress chemical, and it's actually a blood thickener. So when it's released in the system, it is nature has put it there so that if we are wounded, if we're in this freeze, fight, flight response, if we're wounded, then we won't bleed to death so quickly. So that's what cortisol does. Everything has got a good purpose initially. But the harmful thing of cortisol is that too much cortisol causes the immune system to weaken. We get colds more easily. We get sick more easily, and it also damages the hippocampus. Remember that little shoe horse shaped structure in the feeling brain that I showed you when we were looking at the limbic system? That's long-term memory and learning. For some reason, cortisol tends to target that. And so our memory and learning system suffers when we have too much of a stress chemical in our system. That's the first response. I'm not going to leave you hanging there, but let's take a look at that first response with the big brain here. So we feel distress of any kind, and the way the brain knows that to put us into that distress reaction is any type of a threat. This feeling brain is always scanning for what's threatening. It has these little subconscious scanners. And when a threat is perceived, we're not thinking about it yet, this isn't at the conscious level, it closes this gate, metaphorically, and shifts us down into our protective reptilian survival brain. And at the same time, it releases chemicals that are designed to protect us, but in the long run, they're very toxic to our system, to both our immune system and to our thinking processes. So if we can zoom in on this, here's our stress chemicals. It bathes the brain and the body in chemicals that allow us to get out of the way, to fight, to freeze. You see the chemical there that says noradrenaline. We all know about adrenaline and how adrenaline helps our body move faster. And noradrenaline just means in the brain. The nor part means in the brain. So that's our first response. Now, we have a second response, and this all happens very, very quickly. So much more quickly than what I'm explaining to you right now. So our first response is a gut reaction. We shift down into survival. And then we have a second response that follows up on that. At the same time, there's a slower route. It's kind of like a detour route that moves information up to the thinking brain. So the pathway to the thinking brain isn't completely closed. It's like when you have the main freeway closed and there's a little detour that allows you to get there, but it's always slower. That's what happens in the brain. We've got this little detour route that still gives us access to our thinking brain. So once we finally get to our thinking brain, now we've already had our reaction. We've already had the survival brain activated and we've moved into that stress response. But we can think about it now because we're up in the prefrontal lobes, and then we have a lot of power. If we can actually access these prefrontal lobes, then we have the power of choice. We can adjust the volume. We can decide to turn our reaction down. Maybe this isn't something that's worth being this angry over, for example, so I'm adjusting my level of anger. And we can make a choice for a more appropriate response. I think what I'm going to do is walk away from this situation for a little while, take a deep breath, and then I'll come back and talk to the person after I've settled down a little bit. That would be one example of making a choice for a more appropriate response. So if we go back to our big brain model here, what needs to be in place, which just fell on the floor here, for that to happen, for our ability for this detour route to be open and for our ability to think about our reactions are those pathways we talked about earlier. Those pathways that connect the three layers of the brain: the thinking brain, the feeling brain, and the survival brain. They need to be in place. That's what empowers us. And they are in place because our basic needs are met and because we've had guidance, modeling, and coaching from adults. Now, you may be thinking about, well, what happens if you don't have that detour route open to the brain? What happens? I'm sure I have examples that I can think about in my own life. You can think of your own examples where you never did get up to the thinking brain to think about your reactions. You just reacted. And for many children, they don't make it up to the thinking brain in a particular situation of distress. This has been nicknamed hijacking in a book on emotional intelligence by Daniel Goleman. And hijacking refers to the concept that extreme distress closes both roads to the thinking brain. And so we're kind of stuck in survival, and we react without thinking. We not only feel the reaction, but we act it out. And it's all, again, below the conscious level of thought. So the term hijacking is that our subconscious mind can literally hijack us and get us lost in the situation. We react to the situation and we think about it later. Oh gosh, I shouldn't have said that. Boy, that was really a big mistake. I shouldn't have lashed out like that, whatever it may be. Or in terms of fear and freezing, I know I have severe math anxiety, and I can think of a lot of times in test situations where my brain was definitely hijacked, and I couldn't think of the answers, couldn't process the information until I got out of the testing situation, and then everything came flooding back. You may have some examples like that. So what determines hijacking is the degree of perceived threat and control, and perceived is the key word here. Because it can be something that actually isn't threatening in another person's eyes at all, but it's threatening to the person, to the individual. So if you think about those pathways that are in place, those emotional pathways and the template of those pathways based on early experiences, triggers that connect into those earlier experiences can cause the brain to perceive a situation as threatening that may not be threatening at all. A funny look from another child or an adult that triggers back to abuse that happened when the child was very young, maybe not even remembering it, can cause this extreme hijacking reaction. So the perception of threat makes a difference. And that is very woven, intricately woven into all of our past experiences. What's threatening to us, what isn't threatening to us. I had a very difficult time when I was in school because I was a real different kind of learner. And so I still have a lot of anxiety associated with performance that ties into first grade, for example. And that will trigger this response of hijacking for me, even as an adult. And I've been working on that. The other thing that determines whether or not hijacking is going to take place is a sense of control. So when we feel like we have control over a situation, then that relaxes that feeling of distress, and we're able then to move back up, take that detour route up to the thinking brain and go into action in a way that's appropriate. I presented this information a few years ago for some policemen in Kent, and when we got to this place, they were really excited about it because they were talking about the drills that they went through to help them deal with stressful information, and they went through them over and over and over again. So they felt like they had some control over a situation if it happened. And so when it happened, it was still extremely stressful. They still shifted down into the survival brain, but the feeling of control, they knew what to do in this situation, would allow for that detour route to open so they could make more responsible choices. So that is in the ideal situation, that we have this ratio of control of the thinking brain regulating the feeling and survival brain, not ignoring it. This isn't about denial. This is about connecting with it and working with it and making choices. And so if you look at page 49, this is really key information for working with foster children, I believe. So we have this ratio of control of the thinking brain over the survival brain. So here's a healthy brain where the basic needs have been met, there's been modeling and coaching, and the brain is developing nicely. It's got those nice pathways in place. The ratio of control is about 2 to 1. So the healthy 2 in terms of the thinking brain, 1 in terms of the the survival brain. So there's more power here with the thinking brain. So the thinking brain is going to be able to keep that detour route open quite a bit and make wise choices. But in a neglected or abused brain, that ratio literally drops to 1 to 1. And this is based on several studies that have been done throughout the world, but Dr. Bruce Perry is one of the main people that's studying the impact on the brain of neglect and abuse. And what he's finding is that we have children that have, again, an overdeveloped survival brain, an overdeveloped feeling brain, and the feeling brain can be either in a negative sense or a positive sense, and an underdeveloped thinking brain. Not many pathways connecting the brain layers up, and so you have an even control. And sometimes the survival brain wins, sometimes the thinking brain wins. And then you add on top of that stress and any type of drug, and this ratio dramatically drops. That's true for healthy brains and brains that have a lower ratio of control. It drops when we're stressed out, and I'm sure you can identify with that. When you're under a lot of stress, you fly off the handle more easily. You have a quicker trigger. And alcohol, of course, reduces our inhibitions, and other drugs as well. So we have an even lower ratio of control, if that's the case. And then we have the connection. If you have children that do have this low ratio of control, you have the connection of this low ratio of control and behavior problems, and often resulting in violence. So you've got kids with a quick trigger that have a hyper-vigilant alarm system in the subconscious mind. That perceive stress at the drop of a hat, so to speak. And you've got an exaggerated defense mechanism. So they shift down into survival brain, and that hijacking has taken place, and that survival brain is in charge. Violence, then, being in that survival brain, is often used as a problem-solving tool. Now, this isn't because these are bad children, but it's because this is how their brain has developed in the best possible way that it can, given the circumstances. It's trying to keep the child alive. It's trying to keep the child safe. So if violence starts to be a result of that, there are some contributing or influencing factors for that. And we're now on page 50 in your packet. Alcohol and other drugs, again, it plays an important role in whether or not this reptilian brain response is going to be, a survival brain response is going to be violent. Belief systems and modeling. We live in a very violent culture. There's modeling in our media all the time about solving problems through violence. And then males externalizing in general, and this is a real broad statement, of course this isn't always true, and acting outward, but females possibly bringing violence inward. So they're internalizing that violence and being self-destructive. So it isn't something, violent behavior is not always something that you see outwardly. And then the last point with this is the positive. And again, this is related to Bruce Perry's studies, and that is, how do we influence this then? How can we help a brain form those pathways that are needed for thoughtful, positive behavior? For thoughtful behavior, for a thoughtful response, we need to have those pathways hooked up. And here's what they've found, that a presence of a stable adult, even outside the home, has a very strong impact on rerouting the brain and helping the brain develop in a more positive way. And in addition to that, we have coaching, even from adults that aren't involved in the child's life. Anytime the child has coaching in anger management, for example, it's helping the brain put those pathways in place, because changing behavior literally does change the brain. You see on page 50, at the bottom of 50, an excerpt of just one study, and this is a very short excerpt, and there's mounds of information written about this. A scientist named Emmy Werner has a 4-decade longitudinal study of seriously at-risk children who matured into successful adults. And what she found is that they received unconditional love from family or non-family mentors. These people encouraged their curiosity, interests, and dreams. There's the eustress idea. And assigned them responsibilities that help them to discover their strengths and their weaknesses. So there's the guidance, the modeling, the coaching. So can you get a sense of how important your role is with these children that you've taken into your home? You're helping the child meet their basic needs by helping the child feel safe emotionally and physically. You're helping the child get their feeling brain needs met by helping them feel loved and accepted. And you're helping the child develop their prefrontal lobe, their chief executive officer of the brain, by your coaching and by your guidance, and helping them get these pathways into place, so that when they do come across stressful situations, which is part of life, they have choice. You've truly empowered them. Now, on page 51, there is a 2-page, actually, nope, 3 pages, of what to do in the event of a hijacking. So this is a series of thoughts that have been put together of, what happens when you're dealing with another person. It can be a child or it can be another adult who has shifted down into the survival brain, who's in survival. What happens to you? How can you best work with that situation so you don't end up in the survival brain too, where there can be a war, basically, that goes on. So as we work with people that are easily shifted down into survival, we need to be able to have strategies to hold our center and to take the high road and stay up in our thinking brain, our chief executive officer, so that we can best deal with the situation. So I'm going to just highlight some of these for you, and then we're going to move into a site discussion where you can talk about some of the strategies that you use that work for you, or one that you hear about or read about that you think you'd like to try. And that will then take us to, I'm going to give you 10 minutes for that, and that will take us to 8:30. And then we'll come back, and I'll let you know, I'll come back on the screen, and we'll have our call-in question and discussion time. So if you don't have a handout in front of you, if you're at a site that didn't receive handouts, just listen to some of the topics, and then you can think about what it is that you do when you're in a stressful situation. So the first important point on page 51 is that your own anger and frustration fuel the fire. So it truly is, it calls for us to be better than we often feel like being, and to hold that center. Because the minute we consider the child's unacceptable behavior as a threat, guess where we go? We go into the brainstem, and then you have a war. So containing your own anger and frustration, locking in empathy is the next point. Choosing the high road means that we really need to see past the behavior of that child. And sometimes I know that's extremely difficult, or adult. And we need to understand that every unacceptable response the child has is really a cry for help. It's a cry for guidance. It's a cry for coaching. It's a cry for love, even if they don't consciously know that. So that's very helpful for me to keep that in mind when I'm in a situation that's challenging, is to see the behavior as a cry for help. On the next page, avoiding control battles and power struggles. Those of you that went through the Love and Logic training, and if you haven't, I really recommend their materials. This is their catalog, and they are full of materials for how to help kids internalize self-control in loving ways that give them logical consequences that they can learn from. Giving choices with limits. The minute you ask a child to make a choice, you are actually requiring that they move up into that thinking brain, because that's where choice is taking place, up in the chief executive officer. So just the process of saying, okay, here are two things you can do. You can do this or you can do that. If they actually take that in and think about it, they've moved out of survival and they've moved up to the chief executive officer, and you've come a long way just in that. So you want to give choices that fit with your value system, that are simple, that usually two choices is about all you need to do, and that you know that either choice that the child makes is truly going to be okay with you. Keeping a sense of humor. There are several quotes here on page 52, and this is from Mark Twain. I'll just read you the first one. Humor is the great thing, the saving thing after all. The minute it crops up, all our hardnesses yield. All our irritations and resentments slip away, and a sunny spirit takes their place. It can really crack through the defenses if it's done in a spirit of love and compassion and is not sarcastic and not a put down in any way. So there's a balance there. And on page 53 there are some fun examples of one teenager mother dialogue where the mother is using humor in a really effective way. And the last item is let go of your attachment to the outcome. And boy, that's a big one, and it sure is a challenge, isn't it? You can't control it anyway. So we do the best we can, and then we let go. And we need to just surrender to that. Being more process-oriented than outcome-driven is one of the qualities of a really successful parent, because they don't get stuck in the outcome. Parents that succeed with difficult children enjoy the challenge and thrive on finding creative ways to deal with their children's behaviors and problems. Okay, so in your psych groups, if you would spend some time, and let's go until 8:35 to give you some time to discuss this, and then we'll come in for questions. What is one way that you've found to be successful where you choose the high road and stay up in your thinking brain in these distressing situations that can take place? What's worked for you? Or what's one thing that you think you're going to try that you haven't tried before? So we'll come back together at 8:35. You also may be thinking of formulating some questions, and we'll have our call-in question discussion section. Welcome back. Before we start taking call-in questions, I actually had a couple of questions on site that I would like to relay to you. And the first question is a real broad question, and that is, so what do you do with children in terms of really helping them understand and take their own responsibility for making wise decisions, etc.? And one of the things that I've experienced over and over again as I work with children, I go into schools and I work with children of all ages. I go into early childhood classrooms like first grade, and I also go into high schools. And we talk about the layers of the brain that you and I have been discussing tonight. And I keep it very simple, but I give them the definitions, and we talk about the brain stem, the reptile brain. With little children, we use the term dinosaur brain and how that's our survival brain and all of our defenses. We talk about the feeling brain and its need for love. And we talk about the thinking brain and its ability to help us make wise choices and help us monitor our reactions. And one of the consistent responses I get from children is this light bulb, this, oh, so that's why I act that way. And an understanding that when their behavior is inappropriate, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person. It means that they've moved down into this survival or reptile or dinosaur brain. And so I can talk to children about, well, you're in your survival brain now. What are you going to do to help open the gate and get up to your thinking brain? It gives them a different perspective. Children respond to this really intuitively, and it's in a way that's not preachy. When you're working with high school age kids or teenage kids, staying away from that preaching really makes a huge difference, as I'm sure you know. Another recommendation that I would like to make, and this is we'll look at the packet for just a moment, because on page 47, at the bottom of 47, under the stress section, there are some recommended resources. And there are two really wonderful books that are full of ways to help children manage stress and to help children get those pathways in place. The first one is good if you have younger children at home. It's called Making It Better, Activities for Children Living in a Stressful World. This author has done a lot of writing for people that work with young children, and the book is very simple, lots of good pictures, lots of ways for children to not only feel loved, but to also help internalize control, manage stress, etc. And the top book that's recommended, Kid Stress, What It Is, How It Feels, How to Help, loaded with strategies for all the way up through late adolescence. And of course, this doesn't not include us as adults as well, because we're constantly on the same path and we're constantly learning. So we have a lot of questions, and the phone number is 1-800-407-9487. So I'm waiting for the first question. And this is an email question. My foster teacher said that I should take my boy to a doctor this summer and have him put on Ritalin. That would help him learn better. I know I need to talk to the social worker, but how do drugs help people learn? That's a very controversial topic. They're understanding more about how Ritalin works with the brain, but they still do not know all of how it works, and they certainly don't know the impact of that. So Ritalin is a last resort. What they think happens is that Ritalin wakes up. It's odd because Ritalin is a stimulant, so why would you give this to some child to help them settle down? But when you think about how these prefrontal lobes, the chief executive officer, works, it really makes sense. Ritalin wakes up this area of the brain, which tends to be kind of in a spacey state for a lot of children that have attention deficit disorder, and it helps them then focus their attention, control their behavior, etc. Sometimes Ritalin is a big help because nothing else, or something in that drug family, because nothing else has helped, and the child is just completely at the mercy of their reactions. However, Ritalin does not help the brain put those pathways into place. When the child is not taking the stimulant, their brain is the same as it was before. So there needs to be, if there is a drug that's being used, coaching that goes along with that to help the child learn to focus, to help the child learn to attend. And so it's behavior that's going to change the brain. So it's something that I would really recommend you look into very carefully. Get on the internet. There's lots of pros and cons about Ritalin. A book that I would recommend, and if you don't catch this and you want to email me later, I'd be glad to let you know this, is Thomas Armstrong, The Myth of the ADD Child. The Myth of the ADD Child, Thomas Armstrong. Very good book, lots of strategies, and also a really, I think, important look at drugs and the impact that they have. Okay, next question. Thank you for calling in. Could you discuss additional activities that enhance development in an abused or neglected child? I would like to come back. It's a great question. I'd like to come back to the emphasis that those basic needs really must be met. So a real focus on helping that child feel safe, helping that child feel loved, and at the same time coaching and guidance and helping the child develop more internalized limits, helping the child deal with stress. The books that I held up a moment ago on activities that help the child work with stress would be excellent. They're full of things that you can do. One example of a stress exercise, it's an exercise that allows the brain to line up, the thinking brain, feeling brain, and survival brain. And so when you feel like you've gone into survival, you can teach this to your child. When they feel like their survival brain is in charge, then you can teach them this physical exercise to do beforehand, and then they can use it as a choice, because you can't learn anything when you're under stress. But it's actually an exercise from Brain Gym, and I'll show it to you really quickly here, and I'm going to move my chair. My husband teaches special education, and he uses this a lot with children that have a very quick trigger, and he gets a lot of success with this. It's going to look kind of strange, but it's quite powerful. So if you sit with your ankles crossed, so I just have my ankles crossed over, you cross your hands, thumbs pointing down, lace your fingers, bring your arms up. If that hurts, you can sit this way. Otherwise, you have your fingers laced. The way that your body is crossed actually realigns the electromagnetic field of the brain and the body and helps these three brain layers start to get into sync. And then you have the child or yourself, or you can both do this, just sit very quietly with their eyes closed. Your tongue is on the roof of your mouth. That's a centering spot, and you breathe. Deep breathing is a very powerful way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. That's the opposite of the stress response. It's the relaxation response. So nice deep breaths. Just doing deep breathing alone actually would be another good thing. And then you come out of that by just slowly putting your fingertips together. Your ankles are uncrossed, and you sit that way for just another moment. That's a very powerful process that you can teach your child and yourself to do. That's from Brain Gym. Okay, another question. Is it possible to spoil a baby? Oh, great question. I love it. Absolutely not. No, 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 no. You're helping those basic needs be met. You're helping the self-soothing pathways be internalized. You can't spend too much time with a baby. Great question. Easy one. Another question. Can reading the same story over and over help a child develop connections? Absolutely. And we talked about this last time when we talked about repetition builds pathways. That's why children love to hear the same story over and over and over again, the same song. That's why they drop their spoon off their high chair over and over and over again. That's why behavior that needs to be changed comes up over and over and over and over again for us to jump in there and help change it and coach, because repetition literally creates pathways in the brain that then build skills. So good question. How can foster parents help a young child to catch up? I'm kind of guessing at the meaning of that question. Again, the learning brain cannot be activated until those basic needs are met. So oftentimes children are behind in school because of the stress. When they're down in survival most of the time, their learning brain is shut down, literally. So working with the emotional needs of the child will help their learning immeasurably, helping them feel that consistency of love and attention and routine. Another thing that can help the child catch up is to literally go back to where they fell behind, and oftentimes schools don't do that. If they're in the 8th grade and their life became disrupted when they were in the 2nd grade and they're reading at a very low level, for example, you have to go back and you do things that you would really do with a younger child. Now that's delicate when you're working with an older kid. And so one really good way to do that is if you have younger children in the home, you have the older child help the younger child. That's a wonderful bonding, but what's really happening is that you're allowing that older child to fill in those skills. So going back to those real basic learning experiences and finding some way that the child can repeat those so that they can get those foundational pathways in place. Okay, and another question. When babies are not stimulated with verbal input, what happens? It's a good question too, and that question ties into our discussion last time about the need to be immersed in a language-rich environment for those hearing pathways to connect. When they're not stimulated with verbal input, they just don't have the same number of pathways in their brain that allow them to process what they're hearing, and then that ties into language, and then that ties in usually to reading and writing. So again, what you need to do is go back and fill in. Start talking, spending a lot of time talking with the child, reading to the child, engaging them in language, and it needs to be interactive. The television doesn't count because they're not interacting with it. Okay, we have a phone call from Yakima.
Yes, hi, this is Monica.
Hi, Monica.
I have a question. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it, but it's something that I've been wanting to know. I have an adopted child who was heroin addicted at birth.
Uh-huh.
From everyone I've talked to, doctors, etc., they've all told me that there's no long-term effects that they really know of at this point. Just when the baby, is an infant, you see the withdrawals or whatever.
Yes.
Do you know, I just can't hardly believe that a child in the womb that's been exposed to drugs, say that with many others, there's not some effect on the brain. Do you know what part of the brain could be affected from, say, drugs like that?
You know, Monica, what I have heard also, I'm involved at the University of Washington in the summer with a 2-week institute, and it's for the layperson on the brain, and there's always a big section on drugs in the brain. And I have also heard that heroin does not seem to have any long-term effects in terms of what scientists know, what their research has shown, after they move through the withdrawal. Looking at, and so I'm going to give you a non-scientific answer, because this is just my own opinion. My own opinion really mirrors what you said, that that everything impacts the child in the womb, and there's a lot of emotional development going on in the womb, for example. And so there could be an impact of just the child not having the natural experiences that they would be having as their brain is developing in the womb. So to just the only thing that I could say to you is just to watch for any red flags, and there's no quick fix for that, but that possibly that could be connected back to an experience that they had while in the womb, while this was happening with the mother, and again, just going back and trying to fill those pathways in. There's an awful lot that scientists don't know yet.
Right. Well, I also have an adoptive niece. She was cocaine.
Uh-huh.
And really, she's a very bright child also, but she has had some speech problems.
Uh-huh.
So I found your program very interesting because I know that it has to affect something. What, you know, you really don't know.
That's right. One thing that is, and this isn't going to help you right now, but one thing that I'm really encouraged about in terms of where science is going is that as they get more sophisticated with these brain imaging devices, where they're going to be able to really be looking inside that child that you were giving the example of, inside her brain, and see what's going on as she's doing a task and see what's working and what isn't working. That will happen someday, but we're not there yet. We're a long ways from that.
Right.
Thank you, Monica.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
Bye. So we're getting another email up. Question, when babies are not, oops, we just had that one. That's the stimulated with verbal input. How does the child, such as failure to thrive, who is not stimulated as an infant, grow new pathways? When is it too late? I have a hunch that person was not in our beginning session, because we really talked about that a lot, that it's never too late. That the brain responds to experiences, whether they be stimulating experiences like the verbal example that was just asked, or whether they're emotional experiences of beginning to feel safe and loved. At any age, it becomes less plastic as we age. It becomes more difficult, but they've done some really interesting studies with people that are in their well into their adult years, and looking at brain growth in certain areas that they hadn't had previous experiences with. And it's truly remarkable in how the brain can respond. So it's never too late. You never want to give up hope, regardless of the age. That's how we can still work on ourselves as well, because as we work on ourselves, we fill those missing pathways in. Another Niyama question, are there any studies that show that aspartame in diet pop hurts the brain? Actually, always, when you get into nutrition, there is controversy. So what one study says over here, I'm sure you've seen this, another study will pop up and say just the opposite. So yes, there are studies that show that this is not, that this is harmful to the brain, but that's not the bottom line. There never is. My intuition with that is to stay away from as many chemicals as possible, because that delicate point of synapse where the brain cells are connecting with each other, and the synaptic gap, which is being monitored by the chemicals that are released, really makes a difference whether or not these brain cells can connect or not. And every chemical we bring into our body impacts that delicate balance. Okay, another question. What areas of the brain are affected when a baby is shaken, and what are the long-term effects? Shaken baby syndrome can come about because when the baby is shaken, since their brain isn't cushioned with that insulation, with myelination, the brain actually gets bruised. It can bleed, it can kill off brain cells, and it depends on what part of the brain hits the skull, because the brain is actually being whacked back and forth against the skull. So I can't answer you what part of the brain is impacted. It's going to be usually one of the outer areas of the brain, the higher thinking brain, the cortex, but it can also be a deeper damage than that. If you have a child that has this problem, then again, keep in mind the idea that even though there's a lot of damage, possibly, that it's still not too late to regenerate some of those missing pathways, and that you can use brain cells that were not damaged, that were still healthy, to move into the areas of damage. Can a child grow new pathways after injury from child abuse? Yes, they can. It's a long, hard road, as I'm sure you know, because child abuse, the emotional impact of child abuse, where they not only are not getting their basic needs met, but the memories of that child abuse, because the emotions are so strong, have imprinted the brain to such a degree that it takes a lot of persistence and a lot of time for the child to start getting new pathways to choose from. And in the meantime, you have these old pathways coming up that are causing the child to have a real quick trigger. And so there's a real delicate period where it doesn't look like anything is really being accomplished, because you still have the child reacting to the old pathways. With your love and guidance and coaching, you're putting new pathways in place. And so there's an area of faith where you need to really hold that vision for the child and keep faith that what you're doing is going to make a difference in the long run. There's a point when hopefully that child will begin to choose those new pathways, and when they do that over and over and over again, choose a different way to react, control their anger, for example, or stop or not withdraw like they always did. If you have one way that you can change behavior, you start to prune out then, through lack of use, some of those pathways that were in place, and it's just little by little, step by step. Things you already know, I'm sure things that you already do. Okay, another question? Last email question. How do you handle an ADHD child who can get along without medication but blames misbehavior on not having medication? Pretty smart. I would talk to the child about the brain. And I would talk to the child about the brain's ability to put its own pathways into that chief executive officer area, and that medication may make it easier, but that certainly doesn't make it impossible to control, and that without the medication, the child is learning to build those pathways on their own. I really encourage all of you, when you have children that can understand this information, and I mean kids as young as 6, that you pass some of this knowledge on, because you have a different platform then to communicate on. Okay. We have no more questions. Those were excellent questions. I wish. And we have about 3 minutes, so we'll do one more exercise as a close. And this exercise, I'm going to drive the camera people crazy, because I'm going to actually move over. Can I do this? Over to the other side of the room for this last exercise. Children that are suffering from the impact of abuse often, well, we all store this abuse in our bodies. And children often have a real strong, tight tendon guard reflex. Tendon guard are all these muscles in the back of our leg here that that help us get in position for fight, freeze, or flight. And so they're often toe walkers. You can see a child with this tight tendon guard reflex they don't actually come down on their heels. That's one of the warning signs. Releasing areas of the body work, actually releases some of the trauma and some of the emotional memories. So one thing you can do is just simply massage, if you have a child young enough, you can do it yourself, the back of the legs. Or you can have the child massage their own. They can sit cross-legged and just kind of work it out, work the back part. Another thing you can do, if those of you that run, this is a runner's stretch. This is a really wonderful way to release stress, because it's deep breathing and it's also stretching this tendon guard reflex. So what you do is you stand up and you put your hands on a chair, and if we can zero down on my feet now so you can see my feet. I have heels on, so this isn't the best demonstration, but you put your leg back as far as you can. This doesn't work real well with this skirt. And then you come up on one heel, and this knee goes forward, and you just hold the stretch. It's just a runner's stretch. And as you do, you can do a deep breathing, and you just stretch just so that you feel it, and then you come back down, and you do the same thing with the other leg. So that's a wonderful stress releaser to do. Relaxing the body really does help release some of the stress response, and it also heals the body of some of the toxicity of those stress chemicals that are in place. So that will take us to the end of our session, and okay, I'm listening to some directions here. So before I give you this last piece, I really would like to express my appreciation for you and all of the powerful work that you're doing with children, helping them create healthy brains. And if you would like to have a certificate for going through this program, you can contact Carolyn Morrison, and we'll put her name back on the screen. And there is her email address and her phone number as well. So thank you very much. And I have an email address and a phone number that is on the front part of your handout. And I would be delighted to talk with you more if you have further questions, or I'm in contact with a lot of different resources, so maybe I can help steer you in a direction that would be helpful. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.